Good afternoon and welcome to Cloud On Air live webinars from Google Cloud. We're hosting webinars every Tuesday. My name is Shane Glass. With me today is Andrew Whippy, and today we'll be talking about the Visualize 2030 Challenge. You can ask questions at any time on the platform, and we have Googlers standing by to answer them. Let's get started. So I will say with a note first, this is a little different than my last live experience, which was a 2010 baseball game I was broadcasting. So
Okay.
I'd imagine this story will be a little different. So we're talking about the Visualize 2030 Challenge today. It's a data-driven story to talk about how at least two of the UN Sustainable Development Goals influence each other and what actions might be taken in order to reach the goals set out in 2030. To learn more about the challenge, we encourage you to visit the link here on the site, on the page. And I think it's really important that we call out here that this is a real opportunity for students that are eligible for the contest, university students, to have a great impact on the improvement of the world around them. So the Visualize 2030 Challenge is done in collaboration with the World Bank, the United Nations Foundation, and the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. We're collaborating with them because it just gives us such a broader reach. And Andrew, I think we'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, so that sounds like my cue. So I'm a data scientist in the Development Data Group at the World Bank. And for people who don't know the World Bank, we're a multilateral institution with about 189 member countries, I think. And we work in the realm of financing and technical assistance for countries, mostly low and middle income countries, to help them on development projects. So things like improving a health system or building new roads or maybe expanding sanitation or electricity networks, stuff like that. But we also work on collecting and publishing data about development. And I guess that's my role in the organization, and that's why I'm here talking to you today. Mm-hmm. So if you kind of skip onto the next slide, I can talk a little bit about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is the focus of the challenge. So the story of these is kind of interesting to talk about this week, because at the moment, not far from where we're standing here in New York, the United Nations General Assembly is meeting. That's right. And they did the same thing, as they do every year. They did the same thing in 2015, as it turns out, on this exact date. And they passed this resolution committing to these 17 goals for sustainable development to take place over the period up to, in general, 2030 is the target date for these goals. And you can already see from the screen, it's quite a broad set of things that they're working towards. But I'll read a couple of that in full, because I think it gives you some sense of the ambition, right? Which you can't necessarily tell from the little picture form. So Goal 1 is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Goal 4 is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Goal 5 is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Goal 10 is to reduce inequality within and among countries. Goal 14 is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. So it's not just about people, it's about the earth environment as well. And Goal 16 is to promote peaceful and inclusive societies, provide access to justice for all, and to build accountable institutions at all levels. So it's a very broad spread of goals. And there's kind of some history to this that's worth kind of keeping in mind, which is that there was a previous set of goals, the Millennium Development Goals, that was kind of agreed on in about 2000 and then carried through to the 2015 point in time. And so this set of goals is really kind of replacing a previous set of targets, many of which were achieved and some which were not in that period. But like I said, these are mostly setting goals to be achieved by 2030. And the thing I think when you listen to them as I read them out, and when you look at them on the screen here, they're kind of big, lofty, general ideals. They're
huge, ambitious.
Right. I mean, they're not things that you can necessarily easily measure. They're kind of a little bit abstract. And so there's a kind of framework under these to make that a bit more measurable, to make this thing really work, which is that under these 17 goals, there are 169 targets. And I won't read all of them out, or even a selection, but they're more detailed, more specific things that you can kind of look at and say, yes, that was achieved, or no, that wasn't, by the time we reach 2030. Mm-hmm. And then underneath those targets, each of them has sort of usually between 1 or 3 indicators. And that's where you really get down to, the rubber hits the road, you get down to these concrete outcomes that can be measured. And I can kind of give you some real examples of those that might make it a little bit clearer. So like I said, the first goal is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. And that has a number of targets associated with it. The first of those targets is called Target 1.1. There's very numerical order to these things. And that is, by 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living below $1.25 a day. And that $1.25 is a kind of international poverty line that is reevaluated from time to time. It's actually moved since then.
Sure.
But that target then has an indicator associated with it. Mm-hmm. And so that's what you'll find in a data set. And that indicator is the proportion of the population below the international poverty line by sex, age, employment status, and geographic location. That is kind of whether people live in an urban or rural area. And so that's the structure of how you get from these lofty, ambitious goals down to something that we can actually take and visualize and talk about in concrete terms. So yeah, that's the first thing. These things have to be measurable.
Right.
And then the second thing that you might have kind of picked up from what I was talking about is that whereas the previous set of goals, we had the Millennium Development Goals, it was very much about kind of country averages. It was a very broad brush approach to looking at this stuff.
Sure.
One of the emphases in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, is to be able to disaggregate that and to look within countries. So, in that indicator for poverty that I read out, you could see it was broken down by sex and by age and by employment status and an urban, rural location. So you're really looking at subpopulations within countries and making sure, as the kind of SDG mantra goes, that nobody is left behind, that everybody is captured in these data sets. So that's the brief intro to the SDGs.
Sure, and so just to summarize that, we're at the high level, you have the end poverty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you dig down into the indicator, that's truly kind of your measurable way of saying, here's how we're making progress, here's where we're making progress.
Exactly. In principle, you should be able to take a country and take a point in time and attach a number to that indicator and say, the poverty rate in Malawi in 2018 is this number.
Got it.
So that's the idea.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So then the next question, I guess for me, is why am I here? Right? Why am I not at my desk at the World Bank? Why am I at Google talking about this contest? And I think that comes down to this slide, which is that data has power, right? And it hasn't always been accessible. So thinking about how it hasn't been accessible, and this is a kind of a mea culpa in a way from the World Bank, that up until fairly recently, and certainly in the pre-internet era, if you wanted to get hold of our data, such as it is, you would send us a check for about $300, and we would send you back a physical disk. And that works fine for sort of libraries and universities and stuff, but it obviously meant that a lot of people around the world didn't have access to this data, right? And especially people from low-income backgrounds, the people who we're most trying to help, this data was completely inaccessible. So in about 2010, the World Bank really swung behind the open data movement, and so now all our data is online. It's free, as long as there's no kind of privacy restrictions stopping us publishing it. That stuff is available to everybody. And that's kind of where this contest comes in, right? This is another way of us promoting our data to getting it out to people and getting people to use it. And I think why that's kind of important, I can give an example of a World Bank project that's based around data, which is this thing called Doing Business. Mm-hmm. And what they do is they go from country to country and they just collect information about how easy it is to operate a business in that country. So how much paperwork does it take to start a company, or how long does it take to get an electricity connection set up? How easy is it to resolve legal disputes? Those sorts of things that are kind of like day-to-day work for a business. And this project has been going for a number of years, and all they really do is publish this data. They publish rankings of countries and so on. But the effect that it has is quite large, because citizens, businesses, journalists in countries will look and say, well, our country is falling behind these other neighboring countries who are better on this measure or this other measure. And so that can kind of promote a sort of responsiveness of government to try and fix some of these problems. And I mean, it's not just about these kind of business measures. The same thing happens with sort of measures of life expectancy, or more recently in some high-income countries, maternal mortality has been sort of getting worse rather than getting better. And there's been a lot of great journalistic work done taking this kind of publicly available data and then writing about it. And then citizens can take that issue and try and do something about it.
So it's in a lot of ways, what I'm hearing you say is that it's a means of accountability for whether it's governments or non-governmental organizations.
Absolutely,
the appropriate body is.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's part of it is really bringing about change. The other side to it that I think is important and we sometimes forget about is just the value in sort of individual citizens of countries understanding what other people in the world's lives are like, how they live. So I don't know if you're familiar with Hans Rosling. He was the late Hans Rosling, unfortunately, but he was a great data visualization, data communicator. And if you haven't seen his stuff, you should get on YouTube after this session and look him up. But one of the points he consistently made was that even the best informed people, I mean, maybe people like ourselves about some of these issues, we still know very little about other countries. And people will still routinely misjudge what the poverty rate is in a certain country, or the unemployment rate in other places, stuff like that. So it's valuable just to have access to this data and people be able to see it and understand the world better.
Yeah, and you hit on a key point there of accessibility, and that's where I come in. So,
That's right.
as our viewers saw earlier, so I manage the Google Cloud Public Dataset program. In public datasets and open data in general, something that it's always been kind of near and dear to my heart. As I worked on my master's, I would spend 10, 12 hours a week searching for datasets, looking for datasets, trying to find something, anything that I could use to work with. And that's kind of how I became passionate about this. But what I've found over time is a few things with public data sets. One is that we'll never truly understand. We could be the leading subject matter experts in the data. We'll never truly imagine all the possible legitimate use cases of this data. So by making it open and accessible, you open it up to a whole new world of innovation and new ideas that you might not have had in the past. But the other thing is, and you talked about this earlier, there is legitimate costs associated with creating disks and shipping disks. But if we can host it out, in this case on GCP, and make it easier for people to get to, we can become a little smarter, we can become a little better, and we can become a little bit more prepared for the world around us. So, I think that's kind of where we've kind of collaborated together is, hosting this data in BigQuery and just making it so much easier for people to get to and to use.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're happy to see our data spread as far and as wide as it can be.
Absolutely, and that's our goal too.
Right.
So I mentioned the Cloud Public Dataset program, just to give you a little overview on that. So we work with public data providers like the World Bank, like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, among others, to host valuable data sets or copies of their valuable data sets in GCP so that users can find them, discover them, and utilize them much more quickly. And what we found is that removes a level of friction or a barrier to entry that keeps people from utilizing data and from doing great things in the first place. I talked a little bit earlier about BigQuery. We have more than 100 data sets available in BigQuery, just past 100 data sets and just past 100 petabytes of data scanned in the 3 years that the program's been running. So we're really excited about that. But it's not all structured data. We do have about 7 petabytes of data in Google Cloud Storage. Most of that is satellite imagery, so from things like the USGS Landsat, from meteorological satellites as well. So certainly a lot of things out there that can unlock the imagination in some ways and can help, whether it's the university student, like those eligible for this contest, or if it's a startup that wants to experiment on this but needs access to the data to do so, they can do so, I think, much faster. Of course, all of our data can be visualized in Data Studio, which is what we're going to focus on today. For those of you that aren't familiar, Data Studio is our free visual analytics product. They can connect the data directly from BigQuery, from the user interface, or from other directions, whether it's the BigQuery data connector in Data Studio, or if it's even through Google Sheets. So certainly a lot of options there as well. And don't worry, we are going to play with Data Studio today. And so just a real quick overview, where can we find these data sets? Where can we learn a little bit more about them? I encourage our users and our viewers to go on to GCP Marketplace, where you can see on the left-hand side, there's a list of data sets there, and that'll give you kind of a high-level overview of the data sets, some information about the source, something like where it came from and who's the provider of it, as well as some sample queries and some sample demonstrations to help you get started as quickly as possible. Okay, so this is the fun part. So Andrew, can you tell us a little bit about the World Data Indicators?
Yeah, the World Development Indicators. Yeah, so I can. For a start, it's structured data, right? It's not huge. It's not petabytes like the satellite data might be. In storage size terms, it's a fairly small structured data set. But in terms of development indicators, it's relatively large. So this has been going. It's produced by the group that I work in at the bank, and it's been going for maybe 40 years now, I think.
Wow.
And it's kind of structured as a cube. So you have about 1,500 development indicators on different topics from health and education and poverty and government spending and all kinds of things like that, by about 200 countries, plus or minus, and by about up to 60 years. So the earliest data we have generally is about 1960 that the collection begins, and then some data sets start later than that because it wasn't collected back then.
Sure.
I should say also this is available in lots of ways, not just through your platform.
Absolutely.
So people can go to our website and you can access it directly. You can download a bulk CSV download if you just want the whole thing in one go on your computer. You can access an API that we have to be able to sort of use it programmatically or through R or Python or kind of tools like that. And so you might be wondering kind of what is the connection between this data set and the sustainable development goals that I talked about earlier. And if you were listening really carefully, you might have heard me say, well, there are 1,500 indicators in this, and the SDGs had about 300 indicators underneath those goals. So one thing, obviously, is this is a much more comprehensive data set. And that's partly just because it's been around for a while, and so it's kind of collected a lot of different indicators over time. But also, it's supposed to be more comprehensive. It's supposed to, whereas the SDGs, everything is supposed to kind of relate to a target and this kind of very structured way of thinking about data. WDI is much more a way of just kind of understanding the world and understanding how other countries look in development measures. So to kind of give you an example of things that you might find in here that don't directly connect to the SDGs but might still be interesting, you'll find something like life expectancy in here, right? And there's no SDG target on life expectancy, but what there is in the SDG goals is a target, for instance, 3.3, which is on reducing the burden of HIV/AIDS. And so if you're trying to think about that, it might be useful to actually understand the context of life expectancy in different countries to make sense of that. And I think we may see an example of that later on.
Spoiler alert, we will.
Spoiler alert. But another example of that would be population, right? So there's no population targets for either the world or for countries in the Sustainable Development Goals. But there is, for instance, a target around improving housing and upgrading slums. But obviously that's intimately related to population. So it's useful to have these other indicators alongside the kind of SDG indicators to be able to sort of make sense of the world and tell a better story, I think.
And having that historical context helps you understand, okay, you know, we had the millennial development goals, and now we had the Sustainable Development Goals.
Exactly.
But helps you understand how you got, you know, how did we get where we are today, and what's been done in the past that maybe has or has not worked, and helps you kind of better understand how to tell its story and what's truly happening in the world.
Yeah, exactly. And the data landscape reflects that, right? When I say this started 40 years ago, it didn't start with 1,500 indicators 40 years ago. Right. It started with 2 probably, and it's grown since. And the last thing I should say about WDI is it's not, I'm standing here talking about it, but it's not just the World Bank's work. So we collect data from a lot of partners, from UN agencies, from country governments, from private companies, and they really deserve the credit for collecting the data. We just kind of collate it and make it more easily available.
So it's truly is an effort then from the global community to come together.
It is, yeah. And you hosting on your platform is an extension of that to make it even more available.
Excellent. All right, well, let's dig into the data here a little bit, and let's dig into some of the visualizations. So we'll start here. This is a kind of basic visualization I put together that demonstrates, I believe it's Sustainable Development Goal 8, indicator 8.1.1, which looks at the percentage of the population in a given country that have access to electricity. And so you'll see the heat map up here on the top of the color by country, as I sometimes jokingly refer to it. It kind of identifies, whereas the red is a larger percentage of the population has access to electricity, the deep red, whereas that blue that really stands out in sub-Saharan Africa especially has a significantly lower percentage of the population with access to electricity. And you can see called out there at the bottom are the 15 or 20 countries with the lowest percentage of the total population. And I think this is a great example of what you talked about earlier about how the different indicators break down. Because this is 8.1.1, this looks at the total population, but then 8.1.2 looks at rural populations, and 8.1.3 looks at the urban population with access to electricity. So I think this is a great example and just kind of very high-level overview of what's possible with Data Studio.
Right.
And so let's kind of dig into, you have some examples and I have some examples, and we'll show them side by side?
Yeah, I think so. I think that'll work.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is an example of a visualization that we made earlier in the year. And it comes from actually a print publication, the Atlas of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it was kind of made as a book. You can find a PDF, and there's also an online version that you should be able to find pretty easily. But the point of that publication was to really try and tell these sort of data stories that we're looking at in this contest, in our own particular way, right? So this one is, you're looking at here a map of the world, obviously. And it's a choropleth map. It's the kind of map where each country is colored a different kind of intensity to show a number for that country. And what it's showing is this measure of air pollution called PM 2.5. And PM 2.5 relates to target, I think, 11.6, which is talking about the environmental quality in cities. And PM 2.5 is important because it's a very small size of particle. It's smaller than 1/30th the size of a human hair. And it's the kind of thing that you can inhale, and it kind of will lodge deeply in your lungs, and then it can cause disease. So high levels of PM 2.5 are bad, and there's a World Health Organization recommendation for the maximum exposure you should face. So one of the things I think that this raises a question. This raises for me that's worth thinking about is the kind of you have to be careful around some of these indicators, right?
Sure.
So with the WDI data set, as you've loaded it up, people can find the metadata there, and that'll tell you something about how it was created. So in this case, this is actually measuring that PM 2.5 measure across a country, but then population weighting it. So it kind of reflects the average exposure that a person in that country might have. And that's actually slightly different to what the SDG target is looking at, which is people in cities particularly, rather than people across the entire country or across the world. And maybe only half of people live in cities. So in a sense, this is an interesting visualization, but it's important to bear those differences from the SDG target in mind. But I think you have a version of this as well, right?
Yeah, and so before we step onto that, so PM 2.5 typically comes from burning things,
That's right.
Whether it's fuel, whether it's for cooking, for electricity. But I think some of the areas highlighted here could also be seen as come from natural sources as well.
Yeah, that's right. So I mean, I'm not an expert in almost any of these specific targets, but we produced this book to try and look at these different areas. And so one of the interesting things is to dig into that metadata and say, well, actually, what is this measuring? And it turns out that PM 2.5 also measures a lot of kind of windblown sand. So if you have a city in the middle of a desert, you may have high levels of PM 2.5, and it's not air pollution like we would think of factories and cars and stuff like that. It's kind of natural pollution. And yet it's still measured by this. So that's like another reason that people really should look at the metadata of things that they're visualizing.
Yeah, so we'll flip over to the Data Studio version of this. I've very creatively copy and pasted a lot of the text that was on the World Bank's version of this. But I think one thing that's also really interesting is you kind of tend to see that cluster, right? These kind of countries that see the biggest impact from this tend to be clustered together. And that's important because air pollution doesn't obey the laws of political boundaries, and so it's important, as we mentioned earlier, for this global effort, this global community to come together to work on this. But we talked about the text that's on here, and I think that's we kind of went back and forth earlier about whether you mentioned the World Bank had given a lot of thought to this, and I actually think it's a really great way for the World Bank. I think one of the most valuable things that the World Bank brings to the table here is not just the curation and the data, that's obviously valuable, but that expertise and that understanding of the data as well.
Yeah, so I mean, interestingly, the publication that our version of this came from is entirely data stories, if you like. It's entirely visualizations. There's no kind of paragraphs of text. And that was something that was hard for us to adjust to, because we're like, well, we need to include these caveats and these explanations that we would normally spend a page writing about,
right?
But somehow we need to fit these into 2 sentences that fit somewhere on a chart. So that was a kind of interesting experience for us. But I think it becomes a really powerful way of then simply, but at the same time, kind of richly explaining a story.
Yeah. Okay, so I could sit here and explain exactly what you just explained on the last one, but I think we'd all rather dig into the how it's made on this.
Yeah, I'm curious to see.
Okay, let's take a look. So what we're looking at here now is kind of the dashboard, the view. So you can share this with anybody, anyone, as long as you set the share settings properly, you can view this from their web browser using the share button I've got highlighted here with the mouse. But I think the more fun part is to go into the edit mode. So we've got this pulled up, and this gives you a really nice look at what you'll see when you first enter Data Studio and when you first start working with data. So I'll call this out just ahead of time here. A lot of this text is manually input. I may or may not have run out of time to do it another way. But so you'll notice that it might not scale probably the way would be ideal. But let's take a look at some of the features of Data Studio that have helped us create this visualization here. So I'll select this geographic map that we've created here, and you'll see it pops up a list of your available fields here on the right side, and a list of the dimensions and the metrics that you're measuring here. So let's dig into how we can add data sources, and then how we can begin to work with them for the analysis. So what you'll see here is the data source already loaded up. If I click Add a Data Source, it takes me out to the whole list of connectors. There's 20 some odd Google connectors, and there's more partner connectors down here. For the purposes of this contest, you'll want to use the data sets that are available through the website that we mentioned earlier, the cloud.google.com/visualize2030. So we'll skip out of this for now. I think this is probably less exciting for the viewers than playing around with the data. But if we go into our resource tab again, now we can look at blending data sets. So this allows us to bring together both the World Bank's data sets and the UN data sets. So we don't have we had just the UN data set loaded up in this particular visualization. But if I wanted to come in here and blend this data, what I would do is it's kind of a visualization of a join in SQL, right? Where I would add another data source, and I would say, let's take something I was working with earlier. So the World Bank, for instance, I hear those guys do good stuff. So we'll add that to my report, and then you can see it gives me a list of the fields here, and I can give a common join field between the two. In this case, I would probably use countries, country name, and geo area name, but we'll set this aside for now as well so we can dig into some of the other features. And yes, I'm very sure I want to discard these changes. Okay, so the one last thing we want to dig into, and you can see down here it's on a scale of 1 to 4, which is very different than what the World Bank's visualization was. And what I've done there is I've just created a custom bin for our users to be able to go in and say, once I've created a copy of this data set that we've made available, and that's important because it allows users to edit the data, to create their own fields, to create calculated fields, and it allows me to create the custom bins like these using match statements or case statements so that our users can more clearly visualize things. It can get a little cluttered, right, when you have a map like this that has 100 different colors on it. So I think the World Bank took a great approach to that of really narrowing that down to kind of the 4 key areas to create these areas that stand out. Now, Andrew, if I were to ask you, what do you see that stands out on this map?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, the clustering of dark areas, I think, is kind of jumps out most immediately.
Yeah, and so we were trading favorite data visualization professors earlier, and mine being Stephen Few, who talks about kind of the hierarchy of visual information and how the human brain interprets that. Color being at or near the top. Size, I think, is probably ahead of that, but this very deep red kind of stands out against the contrast of that white background, and so we can see kind of what the for lack of a better term, the problem areas are. Right, the areas we want to focus on.
Right.
And that allows you to kind of call out these areas, whether it's in Africa, it's in Southeast Asia, and I think that really clearly helps you identify the beginning of a trend and the beginning of a story. So we've kind of dug through some of these features in Data Studio. I think one thing that I really enjoy about Data Studio is the ability to drill down at the continent level. So if we take this and we say, gosh, what's happening in Africa is really standing out to me, I can drill down to Africa. So what I really like is you still have the context of the rest of the globe around it, but it allows you to get a closer look at what each of these countries see. And so we'll go back to our view here for a moment. And now you can go over and highlight and say, well, what's the actual value in each of these countries? Here, because they're binned, it's probably less exciting. We'll take a look at a more exciting one later. But it allows you to truly get an understanding of what's happening in that country at a very granular level.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, the reason we binned it is because one of our outputs was a print publication, right? And it's very hard to tell 12 shades of red printed, at least at the print quality we can afford. But on screen, I imagine you could probably get away not binning it and just having the full range of values, and then you'd be able to see that when you hover across.
And that kind of talks to the first visualization we saw, the access to electricity as well. One of the fun things here as well is we've put in a filter for year, and so this allows the viewer to go down and say, you know what, hey, let's look at just 2014, for instance. So it allows me to come down here and select 2014. Now I've got this set to single select. It looks like we might not have data for that year, but so I've got this set to single select, so it'll only show me a single year. But if I had set it to select multiple years, I could show an average, or I could show the sum of those values over time as well. So I think that's another really great demonstration of, hey, what are we truly seeing here, and what's our story here, right? Telling, one visualization does not a story make, but it can tell you the beginning of the story, right? And you can string these together to tell the true story, and of whether it's looking at the historical context of using, the data going back 40, 50 years, or whether it's what the situation on the ground is today. Okay, so let's look at another one then.
Yeah, so this is another visualization taken from our Atlas of Sustainable Development Goals. And this one's kind of interesting because it's kind of an unusual take on in some ways a familiar issue. So this is relating to target 3.3, which includes ending the AIDS epidemic. But rather than taking an indicator on HIV/AIDS, particularly like the prevalence rate, for instance, what we're looking at here is life expectancy. So just to sort of quickly understand what you're looking at, each line represents the history of life expectancy in a particular country, and we've kind of used color to sort of put all the countries on there in a way that hopefully isn't too overwhelming. But what's the first thing that jumps out at you from looking at that?
So I'm kind of looking at the holistic pattern of everything moving, kind of up and to the right, which is good news, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. So I think that's exactly right. One of the things we want people to see is that, well, you can look on the left-hand end, and the lowest life expectancy that a country had in 1960 was 28, which is it's a pretty young age for life expectancy. By 2016, that's now up to 51, the lowest country in our data set. So there's kind of a general improvement across time. But I said that this was a data visualization about HIV/AIDS, right? And so, now we can kind of dig in and say, well, why is that what we're showing? And so what we've done here, we've highlighted in yellow the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's the continent, the World Bank region that was most affected by, or has been most affected by AIDS. But then on top of that, we've also highlighted in a slightly sort of thicker line there, the kind of bold yellow countries that had the highest prevalence of HIV/AIDS over that period. I think there's 10 countries highlighted there maybe. And what you kind of see from that is that those countries, their life expectancy was increasing in line with all the other countries. But then sometime around the sort of mid-90s through to the mid-2000s, they've actually been decreasing. And that's kind of I find that fascinating because it's a reflection of this awful epidemic in terms of kind of dry demographic data that you might not otherwise look at that way.
Right.
And on the plus side, you can see that from about the mid-2000s onwards, these life expectancy lines start to tick up again as treatment gets better, as prevention gets better, as awareness increases.
Yeah, and it looks like they were able to recover most of that loss that they saw in the late 90s or 2000s.
Maybe, right? Maybe.
Yeah, and so I think we'll flip over to the Data Studio version, and that's a great way. We talked earlier about digging in at a very granular level to these data, and you can see, I've chosen to go with obscurity by color to kind of move the context behind it, but using size, we talked about earlier about size being such a big hierarchical importance for how your brain interprets these visualizations. And I've chosen to call out two countries in particular, one being Rwanda and the other being Zambia, by using the size and by increasing the thickness of these lines. And you can see the exact same pattern here. Now, what's really interesting about this is you can mouse over this and you can see, hey, here is exactly what the data was at a given point. So if I come back to, for instance, 1997, like we called out, okay, I can see, the Zambian life expectancy of 43 years, but if I come out here to 2016 or 2015, it's back up to 61, where, kind of where it was closer or maybe even above where it was in 1977 at 51, and so I think this is another great way that kind of some of the features in Data Studio can help the students out there participating in this challenge really understand what's happening here and really show what's happening here.
Yeah. We've explored lots of different sort of interactive tools, and we haven't really done an awful lot of that stuff. But it's a limitation of what we've done in terms of static visualizations, that you can't see the individual data points. You get general trend.
Right, exactly, and that's one thing I like about the interactivity of this is that ability to really kind of again uncover that story that you're going to tell. This is, and I think the World Bank, again, we talked about adding context with text on here earlier. I think the World Bank has done a fascinatingly a great job with this, of adding this context in here. But our users aren't going to have this context when they begin to visualize. And so I like that there's the ability to call this out and to very clearly say, hey, we can discover our own context in here.
Yeah, I think I was telling you before that I suspect when we first produced our version of this chart, we just graphed those life expectancies and we actually noticed the pattern of reductions. And then you look at that and you say, well, some countries are doing something different from the general increase everyone else is doing.
Right.
You probe into it and you can pretty quickly come up with the explanation, and that's the kind of roundabout way by which we would have gotten to it, I think.
Yeah, and as a data analyst, I look at that and I say, what's interesting to me is what's different, right? I mean, that's really what calls out to me is, okay, the general pattern move up to the right is great news and is of importance and should be examined, but really digging into telling that story is what's different and what stands out and what's the cause of that. That's, one thing that's really exciting for me. We talked a lot about kind of using Data Studio last time. I think one thing I forgot to call out is this ability to set the size of the dashboard up front. Now you can set multiple pages. I only have one per visualization here, so don't feel the need to create a massive oversized single page. But one thing I really like in visualization is that ability to use the limitations of your screen size to your advantage, of creating something that the user has to scroll down to discover. I think it helps the storyteller kind of communicate the message, but controlled manner, right? Kind of step users through in a way that they want to see it.
Right.
And so one thing that might be really intriguing is looking at a width of, I currently have it set to what I think would be most convenient for our users on the webinar today, but setting this, maybe set the width a little more narrow and setting the height to 10,000 pixels and really let the viewer scroll through and go through that discovery journey with you. We'll jump back to the slides here, and I think what we've seen here, Andrew, is a really great demonstration of what's possible and how to get started here in Data Studio, and how you can take the WDI data set and really just dig into it and explore and uncover stuff that maybe no one's ever seen before, and that to me is really exciting.
Yeah.
Especially for the students that are interested in having an impact and improving the world around them.
Right, exactly. I think we've barely scraped the surface of the data that's in there, and then
right.
I think you have some other data sets as well there that people can look at and kind of combine to do these visualizations. So hopefully people find some interesting things.
I think they will, absolutely. So we talked a lot about telling a story today. I think that narrative kind of came up a lot. I think what we want students to do here is tell your friends, folks. If you are a student, dig in, have fun visualizing the data set. Use the hashtag Visualize2030, check out the website that's here as well, and make a difference. Who knows, maybe you'll even win $10,000. I don't know anyone that wouldn't want to win $10,000.
Sure.
If you're not a student, tell your friends who are. If you're not a university student, tell your friends who are, tell your family that are, and let them know about this opportunity that we have out there available. Again, the deadline for this is November 16th, so I think that's coming up a lot faster than I expected it to, given that September's almost over. It feels like September just started, so certainly get out and get cracking on this, and we're looking forward to seeing what comes through on this.
Definitely.
All right, well, that's it for us, folks. We're going to step away for just a moment here, but stay tuned for a live Q&A. Andrew and I will be back in less than a minute. Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. I'm still here with Andrew, and we've got some audience questions coming in, so let's dive right into these. Andrew, I think this first one is probably for both of us, but how can data be made more accessible to people around the world?
Yeah, I think there's a few different aspects to that. The internet has made this just vastly different than how it was before. That's kind of the big step change. But there's other things we think about too, like licensing issues can be very restrictive in preventing people from getting access to data that they otherwise might. So we're always working to try and negotiate better licenses with people we get data from so we can share it. And then the other thing that I think is worth bearing in mind too is the number of people who are, especially in lower income countries, who are maybe accessing the internet from mobile devices.
Right.
And so we're always kind of conscious of how long does it take to load the World Bank's webpage on a mobile device on the kind of connection you might have in a developing country, and it's not always good.
Yeah, it's great if you produce the best website in the world, but if no one can load it, it doesn't really
Exactly.
help.
Yeah.
And you touched on licensing. For me, that's probably the big one as well.
Right.
One thing I see a lot of is data sets that are not licensed at all. There's no license attached to them.
Absolutely.
And that can almost be worse sometimes than a restricted license, because it'll scare users off. Users come in and say, I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for using this data set. I'll play it safe, I just won't use it. And so looking at some of the open source licenses that are out there, whether it's Apache, Creative Commons, MIT, whatever one you want to use, attaching that open source license to your data set up front, I think can really help boost that.
And I mean, we're as guilty of that as the next person. Like we used to not do that really well. We're doing it a lot better from now on. Like you can usually find World Bank data sets and the license attached to them.
And it's, I mean, obviously the important part is make the data available, right? But the
Yeah.
licensing is kind of that next step.
Yeah, especially if you want, you maybe want data journalists to use this in a publication, and now
Right.
they're going to care about that a little bit more than maybe a student would.
Sure, absolutely. So this next one is how can we improve data collection to ensure representation and accuracy, especially in developing countries?
Yeah, that's a huge, difficult issue, I think. So it depends a lot on the type of data you're talking about. So, we talked a little bit about poverty data, and a lot of that information comes from like large-scale survey operations that are pretty expensive to run, and that the World Bank and our partners put a lot of money and effort into doing. And those you have the advantage that you're kind of doing a formal survey, so you can actually make sure that it's representative of people in a country. But not all data is like that, right? A lot of data that we use today is this kind of secondary data that you kind of have as a side effect of other things, and so that can be much more difficult to make sure that they're representative. And you kind of have these two conflicting movements. On the one hand, wanting to make sure nobody's left behind and that data is representative, and on the other hand, you kind of have a lot of like big data. So people get really excited about like what can we see from I don't know, people's sort of internet usage or from like there's been a lot of work in development on cell phone data, collecting people who monitoring what kind of patterns you can see in that data, and it can be academically it's really interesting, but it has the downside that you're only collecting information on people who have cell phones, which in some countries is a minority of people.
Absolutely.
So there's not a single answer to that question. I don't think it depends a lot on where the data is coming from and what the topic is.
And so, real quick, what are your thoughts on whether it's representative sampling or kind of subsampling populations to kind of keep costs down for those surveys that you mentioned, but still getting a potentially representative sample of the population?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting actually. I think as we were talking before, and I was reading out that the poverty indicator, and it says proportion of population below the international poverty line by sex, age, employment status, and geographic location, urban, rural. We don't have that now.
Right.
You can go to the World Bank website and you'll find poverty as national averages for some large countries that we do that kind of thing. We sort of cleverly, or the countries are cleverly structuring those surveys to get a kind of urban-rural breakdown. But I don't know anywhere really where you can get great data on that broken down by all of those things. So it's going to take, I think, a little bit of, it's going to take probably resources for a start, more investment, and maybe some clever techniques to get that done.
And there's a privacy issue there too, right? Of saying, if there's only 10 people living in a rural area that are males, then not working. That's another issue.
I think the SDGs aren't going to hit that because they're not disaggregating so much to get down to like cells of 10 people or whatever. Most cases we're probably still talking about hundreds of thousands of people or tens of thousands of people in these the kinds of disaggregates that will be interesting for this purpose. But yeah, that definitely becomes a problem the more fine-grained you get.
Absolutely. So the third one here, from your perspectives, and I think this is probably your perspective, how do you measure success in data collection? What's a win for you guys, and are there any areas that you prioritize over others?
Yeah, so the second is easier for me to speak to than the first part in a way. So from the World Bank's perspective, we sort of have a special responsibility for goals 1 and 10, the poverty goal and the inequality goal. The World Bank's role, at least in recent history, has been to work on poverty particularly, and inequality kind of comes along with that. So particularly collecting data on those things has always been a priority within the bank, although, as I said, we're involved in other areas as well. How do you measure success in your data collection and measurement? Getting good quality data, right? Getting the cleanest data you can get, I think, is important because it's kind of interesting. In my position in working on this data set, the World Development Indicators, I'm not at the sort of collection stage of the data, right? We're generally taking this data from other people who've already collected it. And one thing you can't tend to fix areas in the data once they've reached that point. So collecting data at the point of collection, making sure things are as clean as possible is I think one measure of successful data collection. And there's a lot of technologies that help with that right now. People are walking around with tablets and doing interviews and collecting GPS locations live and stuff like that, whereas in the past that could have been a lot more error prone when you're working with pencil and paper and stuff like that.
Yeah, and especially as 5G starts to roll out internationally, obviously we're at the very, very early edge of that, but having that improved bandwidth and a mobile capacity, I think will help as well.
Yeah, we'll see. I suspect a lot of the places they're collecting the poverty data, they're lucky if they have 3G.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But yeah, that's certainly, again, we talked about that level of investment and resourcing. It's necessary to make the success. So we'll give you a chance to breathe. I'll take the first half of this next question.
Go for it. Yeah, tell me.
But I'd love to hear you jump in. So, what makes a good data story, and what difference is there between a data visualization and an infographic? To me, what makes a good data studio, or story rather, is that ability to walk the user through the journey of discovery, right? Of saying, at this high level, whether it's globally, whether it's regionally, whether it's at a continental level, saying, okay, here's what the situation looks like, but let's dig in and let's learn either why or how this kind of got to be, and walk the user through that journey. And I really like that process of people discovering throughout the process, not giving all the information up front, but using those visualizations to help them understand not only what's happening, but even why or how it's happening. In terms of the difference between a data visualization and an infographic, we were debating this earlier. To me, a data visualization is a lot like what we looked at earlier, where it's truly designed to communicate the data behind it, whereas an infographic kind of is a little more designed to tell a narrative or a story in there. Tends to use kind of less data-y elements.
More design
like
elements.
Pictorial elements.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's interesting too when I think about what makes a good data story. It depends so much on the medium.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can choose the medium you're working in, but sometimes you can't, right? So the atlas that I was showing the visualizations from before, it was kind of like a traditional publication, right? It was a print publication. I wish I had a copy I could plug right now to show you, but also as a PDF, and then it was kind of online as an afterthought to that. And you end up with a really different way of telling a story there than if you start from an interactive mindset. And I mean, some of the stuff you're seeing out of newsrooms now on interactives are just really mind-blowing and amazing because they're starting from that perspective now. They know that they have a certain capacity and a certain attention span from users and stuff like that.
Right. And we talked earlier about some of our kind of favorite professors, right, for data visualization, whether it's Stephen Pugh or Edward Tufte or whomever. I encourage our viewers to go out and really dig into that as well.
Yeah, definitely. And data journalists as well, right? I mean, the stuff the New York Times newsroom does is pretty amazing.
Pretty impressive, yeah. So how can data analytics be applied to social and environmental issues? I'll give an example. Before I came over to Google, I was working with NOAA on to make their data very similar to this, more publicly accessible and usable. And what we found is they had produced some weather radar data as part of their mission, and they had made the data available publicly. It's available on GCP as well as other sources. And the strangest thing came in, a group of ornithologists, so scientists studying birds, came in and said, I can use that data to study bird migration patterns.
Right.
And what's mind-blowing is that to a meteorologist, that's the noise in your signal. But what's the noise to the meteorologist, to the ornithologist, is the signal, and the weather is the noise. So again, we talked about applying data analytics to social and environmental issues. I think the first step is making that data available for people to use, licensing it properly, and then using that to help gain that understanding of the how and why and what's happening behind it, and using that to kind of communicate. And I love the idea of a data-driven application of resources. We talk about this a lot, that resourcing is not infinite, and so using data to make an informed decision about that, I think, is really critical as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think you've ticked off some of the main things there.
So the last one here, and I'm really glad we got this question came in. I forgot to mention it, but many fields in the data sets use abbreviations to store information. Where can I find information regarding those fields, along with the meaning of the abbreviated data inside them?
Yeah, so that's a great question, which I will take since it's our data that we're talking about today. I mean, just to sort of explain why we do that, it's if you start to work with country data at any scale, you very quickly realize that most countries have many different names. So you might have United States of America, you might have United States, you might have USA, you might have America. Like all of those things in different data sets might refer to the same country. So a lot of the times we'll try to use standardized conventions where we can. So for instance, we include the sort of ISO 3-letter country codes for countries, as well as the name, the sort of the World Bank's understanding of the official name alongside there. And so I actually try to use, when I'm doing internal manipulation of data and joining things and filtering things on, I try to use those codes rather than the country names, because I don't like the dependency that countries change names as well. Right. That's something you wouldn't imagine, but you work in this area and suddenly you realize every few years a country will actually change its official name.
Yeah, if you tried to join on Zaire today, you'd have some trouble.
Right, exactly, and those problems are still filtering through data sets you find today.
Sure.
So that's the reason they exist in the first place, to find out what they refer to. So directly, I think as you've loaded it up on your platform, there's multiple tables, and one of there'll be a table for, say, countries, where you'll sort of see the connection between countries to some of the metadata on the country. The same from kind of series, you'll get more information about the series itself from a kind of series table. So you can kind of find that stuff, and I guess you can you can access that through the platform as well. But if you go to our website, the World Development Indicators on the World Bank website, you can fairly easily dig into that stuff. We often have, it's not all as obvious as it should be. Some of those things are, you may have to dig down a bit. And then as a last final resort, we also have a data help desk email address, which I wish I knew right now, but I don't. But if you Google World Bank Data Help Desk, I'm sure you'll find the page that gives you the email address, and they're pretty good at answering those queries. If you find something you just can't make sense of.
Yeah, and we talked about blending earlier. I think that's another that you mentioned, a great way to kind of just explore what some of that means and whether it makes more sense for you to have the full name on your visualization.
Exactly.
Or to have, some of the abbreviated names as well.
Yeah, I mean, three-letter country codes are great for me, but most people don't find them particularly intuitive. So.
Sure. No, I feel the same way about airport codes.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay, well, that is it for today. Tune in next Tuesday for the next Cloud on Air. Thank you for watching.
Thanks.